The overcast July morning of 2025 began with an unusual disturbance on a gravel lane at the edge of Boerne, a small mountain town in the far northern reaches of Shasta County, California. 3 unmarked vehicles, 2 gray sedans, and a dark sport utility rolled to a stop along the shoulder a short distance from a modest single-story house, set back among the pines. The engines went quiet almost at once. Tactically dressed officers, their movements unhurried and rehearsed, stepped out and spread along the property line without raising their voices, taking positions near the driveway, the side fence, and the line of trees that screened the house from the road. The morning was cool for July at this elevation, the air still holding the smell of pine sap and wood smoke from a stove somewhere down the lane, and the only sound was the low ticking of a cooling engine and the distant complaint of a jay. Inside the house, a man named Roger Schmidt, 61 years old, was beginning an ordinary morning. He had lived on this lane for decades, a quiet neighbor whom most in the area regarded as unremarkable, the kind of man who waved from his porch and kept to himself. At a measured pace, an investigator approached the front step and knocked, and when the door opened, the words that followed were brief and procedural. Roger Schmidt, a warrant has been issued for your arrest in connection with the 1984 death of Terrence Arndt, near Boerne. According to those present, Schmidt did not resist and did not protest. He stood in the doorway in the gray morning light, his expression difficult to read, and asked only what this was about, his composure described afterward as unnervingly settled, as though some part of him had been waiting 41 years for this knock at his door. Then the scene cuts away, from the present to the past, from a quiet arrest on a mountain lane to a single dark stretch of road one autumn night in 1984. Because the story of how the man at that door came to stand there is a story that turned, in the end, on a detail no one had looked at for 40 years. Before we go any further into this case, let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. And if you find these stories meaningful, take a moment to subscribe so you do not miss the next case file. Boerne sits in the high country of far northern California, in the eastern half of Shasta County, where the land climbs away from the Sacramento Valley into a country of volcanic ridges, lava beds, and dense conifer forest. It is a small place, a few thousand residents spread along a state highway, and the lanes that branch from it, ringed by the dark green wall of the Lassen and Shasta forests, and shadowed to the south and east by the long bulk of the mountains. By day, it is a town of timber and trout streams, of a single main road lined with low buildings, where neighbors know one another's trucks by sound. By night, it becomes something else. The streetlights are few and far apart, and they end abruptly where the town does. And beyond them, the forest roads run out into a darkness that is total and unbroken. A darkness with no shoulder lighting, no cameras, and no houses for long stretches, quiet enough that a vehicle could sit parked on a turnout for an hour without a single passerby noting it. In the autumn of 1984, this was a place where young people did what young people in remote towns have always done. With nowhere to go and little to do once the businesses on the main road closed, they drove. They parked along the forest turnouts and the logging spurs, on the dark margins of the reservoir and the dead-end lanes, in the few private places a small town affords, and there they talked and listened to the radio and waited out the long mountain evenings. These turnouts were known to everyone and watched by no one. They were unlit, they were deserted after dark, and they were chosen precisely because they were unobserved. That same quality, the very isolation that made them a refuge, would also make them a place where something could happen and leave almost no trace, and where for nearly 40 years afterward, no one would be able to say with certainty exactly what had. Terrence Arndt was 18 years old that autumn. Those who knew him described an ordinary young man at the start of his adult life, recently out of high school, known around town, with the open and uncomplicated future that an 18-year-old in a small place is supposed to have. He had a girlfriend, also young, whose name will be kept private here out of respect for what was done to her and what she has carried in the years since. On the night in question, the two of them did what countless couples in Boerne had done before. They drove out to a quiet turnout on a dark road at the edge of town, away from the lights, away from the main road, and they parked the car, and for a while it was only the two of them and the cold and the enormous silence of the forest pressing in on the glass. The night was cold in the way that mountain nights in far northern California turn cold once the sun is gone, the temperature falling sharply with the elevation, the heat of the day draining out of the thin high air the moment the light failed, the cold settling down through the conifers and pooling along the low ground where the road ran. The windows of the parked car began to fog from the warmth inside, the engine ticking as it cooled, and then falling silent. Around them, the forest closed in, not as a wall, but as a presence. The dark trunks ranked away into a blackness the eye could not penetrate. The only sounds, the small involuntary sounds of a cold forest at night, a branch settling, a far animal, the wind moving high in the canopy where it could not be felt below. It was the kind of dark that a person raised in a city never truly meets, a dark without edges, in which the nearest light was the town behind them, and the next was the stars when the canopy allowed them. The road they had chosen was unlit. The nearest occupied house was not within sight. There were no cameras anywhere in that country in 1984, and there would have been none even in a far larger town in that year, for the surveillance that now lines every road and storefront simply did not yet exist. The road carried almost no traffic after dark, an hour or more between any pair of headlights, and often nothing at all until morning. In every way that matters to what followed, the place was perfectly ordinarily private. The kind of privacy a small mountain town offers freely and without suspicion, because such privacy has always, in such a town, been harmless. That privacy was about to become two other things at once. It would become the means by which a man could approach a parked car in the dark, unseen, and it would become the reason that no one for 40 years would be able to say who he was. What is known, established later through physical evidence and reconstruction, rather than through any account given at the time, is that Terry Arndt and his girlfriend were ambushed. They did not go looking for trouble, and trouble did not arrive by accident. Someone came to that parked car in the darkness, someone who was not a friend and not known to them as a threat, and in the space of a few violent minutes, the ordinary evening of two teenagers became a homicide and an assault that would haunt a small town for 2 generations. Terry Arndt was shot and killed. His girlfriend was sexually assaulted. The precise sequence of those few minutes, the order of events, the words spoken, the exact movements of the attacker, are things that investigators have never publicly detailed in full, and it would be a disservice to the people involved to invent them here. What the evidence supported and what the case was ultimately built upon is the brutal shape of the crime. A young man dead in a parked car, on a dark road, a young woman who survived a terrible assault, and an attacker who walked back into the darkness and the cold and was simply gone, leaving behind a scene that the technology of 1984 could examine, but could not, for 40 years, explain. The attack bore the marks of an ambush rather than an escalation. The location was not one the attacker could have stumbled upon by chance in the dark, unless he already knew the road, knew the turnout, knew that couples parked there, and that the place was unwatched. Consider what the darkness of that lane actually meant in practical terms. There were no streetlights beyond the edge of town, and the edge of town was behind them. There was no moon to speak of, or none that the canopy of conifers would have let through to the turnout in any useful measure. A man standing 30 feet from the parked car would have been invisible to anyone inside it, and a car with its windows fogged from within by the warmth of 2 people against the deep cold would have been, in effect, a lit box in an ocean of black, its occupants able to see almost nothing beyond the glass, and themselves perfectly placeable by anyone in the dark outside. The geography did not merely fail to protect them, it actively favored the attacker, hiding him while it framed them, and a man who understood that geography held every advantage the night could give. To approach a parked car on an unlit forest lane in a cold so deep the windows had fogged, and to do so without being seen or heard until the last possible moment, required either extraordinary luck or genuine familiarity with that exact stretch of road. A stranger would have to find, in total darkness, the one turnout among many where a car happened to be parked, and to approach it, across unfamiliar ground, without betraying himself by a stumble or a snapped branch or the sweep of headlights. A man who lived nearby would need none of that luck, because for him the road held no surprises. Investigators at the time could not say which it had been, luck or familiarity, and they did not pretend to. They could only record what the scene told them, and what the scene told them was that whoever had done this had come and gone through a darkness that hid him completely, and had done so as though the darkness were no obstacle to him at all. The cold and the dark, which had made the turnout a private place for 2 teenagers, now did their second and crueler work. There was no lighting to catch a face. There were no witnesses on a road that carried no traffic. There was no camera in that whole country to record a vehicle arriving or leaving, no automated eye of any kind, none of the dense net of recording devices that would, in a later decade, make such a vanishing nearly impossible. The same isolation that the young couple had sought for privacy had delivered them instead into a place where a crime could be committed in near total concealment, and where the single most important question, the question of who had done this, would have to be answered, if it could be answered at all, not by an eyewitness, and not by a confession but by physical evidence alone, by whatever trace of himself the attacker had failed to carry back into the dark. In 1984, the trace existed and could not be read. The whole remaining length of this story is the story of the 41 years it took to learn how. When the crime was discovered and reported, the response came as it would in any rural county in that era, through the local sheriff's office and the resources available to a small mountain jurisdiction in 1984. What followed at the scene was, by the standards of its time, careful and thorough, and it is worth narrating not as a single line. The scene was processed, but as the deliberate step-by-step procedure it actually was, because it is in that procedure that the seed of the eventual solution was, without anyone yet knowing it, preserved. The turnout and the vehicle were secured. The area immediately around the car was examined first. The ground searched in a measured grid for anything the attacker might have dropped, disturbed, or left behind. Investigators recorded the position of the vehicle, the direction it faced, the state of its windows and doors, the condition of the ground beneath and around it. They noted the absence of clear tire impressions from a second vehicle on the hard surface of the turnout, and they noted that the surrounding forest floor, layered with pine needles and the fallen debris of autumn, did not readily hold a footprint. They worked the way investigators are trained to work, recording each observation without inference, marking what was present and what was absent, and refusing, per procedure, to draw a conclusion from any single finding before the whole picture could be assembled. Inside and around the vehicle, biological evidence was located and collected. This is the quiet center of the entire case, the point on which everything else, 4 decades later, would turn. And so it must be stated plainly and then set down, the way the investigators themselves set it down. From the scene, material was recovered that did not belong to the victims. It was the attackers. In 1984, it could be collected, preserved, and described in only the most general terms: blood typing and the serological methods of the day, which could narrow a population, but could not name a man. It was carefully packaged, labeled, sealed, and entered into evidence under chain of custody, logged as material of unknown origin associated with the assault, recorded without inference as to whose it was, and placed into storage. No one who sealed that envelope in 1984 could have known that they were preserving the single object that would, 41 years later, put a man at a door with his hands behind his back. The examination extended outward in widening passes. The interior of the vehicle was processed for the violence it had contained, surface by surface and seam by seam, the way an interior is worked when it may be the only thing the case ever has. The glass was examined for the residue of the cold night that had fogged it, the upholstery for the disposition of what had been spilled upon it, the door panels, and the dash for the marks of hands that had braced or struck, or steadied. Each surface was photographed before it was touched and recorded after, and the items lifted from it were collected separately, each into its own labeled container, each logged against the position from which it had been taken, so that nothing recovered from the vehicle could later be confused for anything recovered from anywhere else. This is the discipline that 4 decades later would make the difference, because evidence that cannot be located in space and time is evidence a court will not trust. And the investigators of 1984, whatever the limits of their science, kept their record clean. The ground was searched again, more slowly, for a shell casing, for a discarded object, for any trace of the weapon that had killed Terry Arndt. The grid was walked a second time and then a third, the searchers moving shoulder to shoulder across the turnout and out into the margin where the gravel gave way to the forest floor, their eyes down, their pace deliberate, lifting the autumn debris where it lay thick and recording the bare ground beneath. A casing, had one been ejected, might have lodged anywhere in that litter of needles and cones and fallen leaves, and so the search did not assume the easy find. It assumed the difficult one and worked for it, and when the easy find did not come and the difficult one did not come either, the searchers recorded that result too, the absence logged as carefully as any presence, marked without inference, set down as a fact about the scene rather than a verdict upon it. The forest edge was walked, the slope beyond it surveyed for disturbance, the lower branches checked for the snag of cloth, the soft ground in the shaded hollows examined for the press of a foot. The turnout was photographed from every angle in the flat film of the period, the images limited by the cameras and the conditions of that night, frames that captured what little the dark allowed and no more. And these would be returned to in later years and examined again under tools the photographers could not have imagined, scanned for the figure at the margin, the detail at the edge of the frame, that the eye of 1984 had passed over. Each item recovered was inventoried, each location staked and measured, the distances between points recorded to the foot. And at the close of that long first effort, the investigators were left with a scene that had given them a great deal of careful documentation and almost nothing that pointed to a name. The medical examination of Terry Arndt established the cause of death, a gunshot, and the manner, homicide, findings that carried none of the ambiguity that surrounds a missing person or a body found long after the fact. A body found decades later in a forest or a lake offers a forensic examiner only what the years have left, and much must be inferred from little. A body recovered the morning after offers everything, and so the examination of Terry Arndt could speak with a precision that the later, colder cases in this lane so rarely allow. The cause was a gunshot. The manner was homicide. There was no mystery about whether a crime had occurred, no possibility of accident or misadventure to be argued in the years to come, no question of whether the young man had met some natural or self-inflicted end. The medical record closed those doors at the outset and left open only the single door the whole case turned upon, the door marked "Who," and the survivor, the young woman who had lived through the assault, gave what account she could of an attacker who had come out of the dark, an account constrained by the terror of the moment, the absence of light, and the speed with which it had all happened. It must be said plainly that what could be asked of her was limited not by any failing of hers, but by the circumstances the attacker had chosen. He had come out of a darkness with no light to reveal him. He had moved with a speed that left no time for the careful registering of a face. The human memory, under terror, in the dark and the cold, does not function as a camera, and no honest investigation pretends that it does. She could describe what had been done to her, and that description, together with the medical and physical evidence, established beyond argument that an assault had occurred and the shape it had taken. She could not, through no fault of her own, hand the investigators a face. What she could not give in 1984, the evidence she had survived, would, in the end, give for her 41 years later, and through a science she could not have imagined on the night it was taken. What the investigation faced in the weeks after the crime was the hardest problem a rural case can present: a violent, clearly intentional homicide with a surviving victim, committed in a place engineered by its own geography to yield no witnesses, against an attacker who appeared to have left no usable trail. The search that followed was wide, and it was patient, and it failed, and the manner of its failing is itself worth narrating, because in this lane of cases the empty result is never anticlimax. The absence of a trace was, increasingly, treated as a kind of evidence in its own right. The road itself was canvassed. Investigators worked outward from the turnout along the lane in both directions, identifying every residence within plausible distance and interviewing those who lived there. One household at a time, the canvas radiating from the scene the way a stone's ripple radiates from the point where it falls. They asked the questions a canvas asks: a vehicle heard on the road that night, an engine at an odd hour, a shout, a shot, headlights where headlights did not belong, a figure on foot where no one walked after dark. They asked when each household had gone to bed, what each had heard before sleep, whether dogs had stirred, whether any vehicle was known to use the lane after dark, and whose it was. They recorded each answer and cross-checked it against the others, looking for the account that did not fit, the time that did not square, the neighbor whose night could not be placed. The answers were the answers a dark and empty road returns. No one had seen a second vehicle. No one could fix a time. The few who recalled hearing anything at all in the deep cold of that night could not say what it had been or precisely when, and the sounds they described, an engine, a noise carried across the trees, dissolved under questioning into the ordinary night sounds of a town that backed onto a wilderness. A man who lives at the edge of a forest learns not to hear it, and the forest at night is never truly silent, so that a single engine on a far lane, a single sharp sound across the cold air, registers as nothing, is filed by the sleeping mind as weather, as an animal, as the ordinary settling of the dark, and is gone by morning. The canvas produced no witness because the geography had been built, by nothing more deliberate than its own remoteness, to produce none. And among the households the investigators visited and recorded and cleared in those weeks, working their patient ripple outward from the turnout, was in all likelihood the household of the man who had done it, a neighbor on a nearby lane whose night, in 1984, no one had any reason to doubt. The forest around the turnout was searched on foot for the discarded weapon, and for anything the attacker might have shed in the dark. Investigators walked the margins of the lane and the slopes beyond it, working through the deep accumulation of needles and leaf fall that a Northern California conifer forest lays down each autumn, a forest floor that swallows small objects whole and gives them back only by accident, if at all. They worked outward in expanding arcs from the turnout, on the theory that a man fleeing on foot in the dark, carrying a weapon he wished to be rid of, would not carry it far, and they concentrated their effort on the ground a person could reach in the first minutes of flight, the ditches, the brush line, the soft earth where a thrown object might press a mark. They lifted the litter and recorded the ground. They followed the slope to where it steepened, and the searching became guesswork. The firearm was not found. No clothing, no dropped possession, no abandoned tool surfaced from the search. And here the cadence of the case became the cadence that would define it for the next 40 years. No weapon, no second set of tracks, no witness, no vehicle, no name. Each negative was recorded, set down in the file beside the last, and the accumulation of negatives, the long corridor of closed doors, began to feel less like the absence of a case, and more like the signature of a careful and deliberate attacker who had given the dark forest nothing to keep. A scene that yields nothing is, to an untrained reading, a scene that says nothing, but to an investigator the manner of the nothing is itself a message. A panicked stranger leaves a trail of his panic. A man who flees in disorder drops what he carries, snaps the brush, sinks his weight into the soft ground, leaves the forest disarranged behind him. This scene was not disarranged. The weapon had been carried away with intention. The ground bore no record of a stumbling flight. The very tidiness of the absence spoke, and what it spoke of was a man who had not panicked, who had moved through that darkness as through familiar country, and who had taken away with him everything the forest might otherwise have kept. That framing, the reading of absence as evidence, was not wishful thinking. It was the disciplined interpretation of a scene that was, in the investigator's own assessment, too clean for an active impulse and too quiet for a struggle that had drawn attention. An attacker who left no weapon had carried it away. An attacker who left no second track had moved across ground that held no track, or had known how to move across it. An attacker who was heard by no one had chosen, or had been delivered by chance, a place and an hour in which there was no one to hear. The very thoroughness of the absence pointed back again and again to the same uncomfortable inference, that this was not a random eruption of violence by a stranger passing through, but something closer to a planned approach by someone who understood that exact dark road. Yet inference was not proof, and the investigators were careful in the records of the period to hold the line between the two. The reading of the scene as the work of someone familiar with the area was noted as a working interpretation, consistent with the evidence, but it was not and could not be treated as a conclusion. There was no shortage of theories a careful detective could entertain. The discipline of the case, in those first weeks, lay in entertaining them all and committing to none, in marking each observation without drawing from it more than it could bear, and in preserving, above all, the physical evidence that the technology of the day could not yet read. Before the investigation could narrow toward the man who did this, it had to do the patient, unglamorous work of widening first, of laying out every explanation that did not require a deliberate killer, and disproving each one in turn. This is the funnel through which every honest cold case must pass, and at the standard of 40 years ago, it was walked carefully. 3 principal alternatives stood between the investigators and the conclusion the evidence kept pushing them toward, and each had to be taken seriously, examined on its own terms, and set aside. The first alternative was the possibility that the death was not a homicide at all in the ordinary sense, that what had occurred was an accident, a tragic mishandling of a firearm in a parked car, a moment of carelessness rather than malice. It was the kind of explanation a community prefers, because it asks for no monster. It did not survive contact with the evidence. The medical findings, the nature and placement of the gunshot, and above all the assault upon the surviving victim, were wholly incompatible with any accidental account. An accident does not assault a second person. An accident does not approach from the darkness. The physical facts of what had been done to the young woman foreclosed the comforting reading entirely, and the accident hypothesis was recorded as considered and excluded on the evidence, without inference beyond what the evidence supported. The second alternative was that the crime, though deliberate, was personal, that it had grown out of the victim's own circle, a jealousy, a grievance, a relationship gone wrong, the statistically common shape in which young people come to harm. This possibility was not dismissed lightly, because it is the right place for any investigation to look, and the statistics demand it. Harm to the young arrives far more often from someone known than from a stranger in the dark. And an investigation that fails to clear the circle first is an investigation that has skipped its most basic step. So it was pursued in the ordinary way, through the people who knew Terry Arndt and his girlfriend, through their friendships and their associations and their recent history, through the rivalries that attend young lives, through the question every detective must ask of whether the danger had been close all along, whether the attacker had been not a figure from the darkness, but a face the victims knew and had no reason to fear until the moment it was too late. That avenue was worked, and worked carefully, and on the evidence available it did not hold. The known circle did not produce a person whose account failed under questioning, whose whereabouts on that night could not be placed, or whose connection to the crime rose above the level of the painful but ordinary frictions of young lives. The accounts checked out. The whereabouts were established. The frictions, where they existed, were the frictions of teenagers, and not the architecture of an ambush. Investigators have not publicly detailed every step of that elimination, and it would be wrong to invent the names and the alibis of people who were, in the end, cleared of any part in this. But the case as it ultimately resolved confirms its result beyond argument. The harm had not come from within the circle at all. It had come from outside it, from the dark edge of the road, from someone the victims had no reason to fear because they did not know him as a danger, did not perhaps know him at all, a neighbor whose face, if they had ever seen it, carried no warning. The third alternative was the transient stranger, the drifter passing through on the state highway who turns off onto a dark lane at random, commits an atrocity, and is gone by morning into another county and another state, never to be connected to the place, because he had no connection to it. This is the explanation that makes a case truly hopeless, and for a long time it could not be ruled out because nothing about the physical evidence in 1984 could distinguish a stranger from a neighbor, and yet the scene itself argued against it. A drifter does not reliably find, in total darkness, the one unlit turnout where couples park. A stranger to that country does not move through the leaf fall and the slopes without leaving the disorder of a man lost in the dark. The reading of the scene as the work of someone who knew the road sat uneasily against the random transient theory, and so the third alternative was held open, as it had to be, but held under suspicion, a possibility that the evidence tolerated without ever quite endorsing. It would take 40 years and a technology no one in 1984 could imagine to collapse that final possibility and replace it with a name. By the time the active phase of the investigation began to slow, the case file had become a careful catalog of a crime that refused to name its author, and it is worth pausing over that catalog item by item the way the investigators did, because each entry would matter, and one entry would matter more than anyone could yet know. An inventory read aloud is its own kind of testimony to thoroughness, a record of every door the case had opened. And so, here is what the file held. There was the vehicle, with its fogged and broken record of the violence it had contained, photographed, measured, and documented, inch by inch. There was the location data, the precise position of the car on the turnout, its orientation, the distances to the road edge and the tree line, the topography of the slope beyond. There were the scene photographs, the flat film images of a dark place rendered, as well as the cameras and the night allowed, frames that would later be examined again and again for what they might have caught at their margins. There were the medical findings on Terry Arndt, the cause and manner of death set down without ambiguity. There was the forensic record of the assault on the surviving victim, collected and preserved with the care such evidence demands. And there was the biological material recovered from the scene that belonged to neither victim. This was the spine of the case, though no one in 1984 could have called it that, because in 1984 it could not yet speak. It had been collected, sealed, labeled, and logged. It could be typed by the serological methods of the day and described as belonging to a population, a blood type shared by some fraction of the men who might ever be suspected. Useful for exclusion, but useless for identification. It could not name a man. It could only wait, and so it was placed into the evidence storage of a small mountain county, and there it sat, a sealed envelope holding the one true answer to the whole case, decades before the science existed to ask it the question. Beyond these central items, the file held the supporting texture of any investigation, the interview records from the canvas, household by household, and answer by answer, the field notes taken at the scene in the cold of that first morning, the maps with the search grids marked upon them, in the careful hand of men working a grid by lamplight, and by day, the inventory of the fruitless forest search, with each arc and each negative recorded, the logs of leads pursued, and leads exhausted. The names of those questioned and the reasons each was set aside. Dozens of pages were generated. Dozens of people were spoken to. The county committed what a small county can commit, which is patience and care rather than the resources of a great metropolitan laboratory. And within those limits, the work was honest and complete. And the whole of it pointed in the same direction it had pointed from the first night, toward a man who had come out of the dark and gone back into it and left behind, of himself, only a sealed envelope no one could yet read. Every line of the file converged on that envelope, and the envelope, in 1984, said nothing. The investigators had built a perfect record of a crime and could not name its author. And they knew it, and they recorded that too, because a careful investigation records its own defeat as faithfully as its progress. They had done their part. They had preserved the evidence, kept the chain of custody intact, refused to discard the one item that could not yet be used. What they could not do was finish the work, and so they did the only honest thing a careful investigation can do when it has run out of road. They held the line, they kept the file, and they waited for a future they could not see, trusting it, without any guarantee, to do what they could not. The years closed over the case the way the cold closes over the high country in October. Quietly and completely, the active leads ran out. The canvas had been walked, the forest searched, the circle of the victims examined and cleared, the transient theory left open and unanswerable. There was no weapon to test, no witness who could name a face, no technology that could turn the sealed envelope in storage into a man. And so the file passed into the long dormancy that gives these cases their name, reviewed from time to time as the years allowed, and each time closed again with the same conclusion, that nothing new could be done. This is the part of the story that the calendar tells faster than any narration can. The 1980s became the 1990s, and the 1990s became a new century. And through all of it, the case of Terry Arndt and his girlfriend remained where it had been left, a homicide and an assault on a dark road, unsolved. Each time the file was reviewed, by a new investigator inheriting an old caseload, or by a periodic survey of the county's unresolved matters, it was read again from the first page and closed again with the same conclusion, that the evidence had been preserved, that no avenue remained that the available science could open, and that the case must wait. Year after year, that identical entry was made, a record of diligence with no result, the file thickening only with the notations of its own dormancy. The town did not forget. In a place as small as Burney, a crime like this does not become a statistic. It becomes a permanent fact of the local weather, a thing parents thought of when their own children drove out to the turnouts on autumn nights, a question that hung over the lane where it had happened, a name spoken with a lowered voice. The seasons turned over the high country as they always had, the summers of trout streams and timber giving way to the long autumns of leaf fall and the deep mountain winters. And each autumn the turnouts filled again with young people who did not know, or knew only as a half-remembered story that one of those dark roads had once taken a life. People grew up, grew old, moved away, and died, and somewhere among them, on that same lane, lived the man who had done it, and no one knew. He aged as the town aged. He became an old neighbor where he had been a younger one. The mile between his door and the turnout never lengthened, and never shortened, and for 40 years it was a distance no one thought to measure. What did not happen, in all those frozen years, was the thing that solves so many cases by ordinary means. There was no deathbed confession that reached the authorities, no falling out that turned an accomplice into a witness, no boast overheard in a bar that found its way back to the sheriff's office. The attacker had told no one, or had told no one who told. He had left the dark road and walked back into an ordinary life, and the very ordinariness of that life was its perfect cover. The case did not stall because anyone gave up. It stalled because the one piece of evidence that could end it was waiting, sealed, and silent, for a science that had not yet been invented. And until that science arrived, there was simply nothing more that even the most dedicated investigator could do. To understand how this case was finally solved, it is necessary to look closely at that single piece of evidence twice, once as it was in 1984 and once as it became in the 2020s, because the entire 41-year arc of the case lives in the distance between those two examinations. It is the same physical material in both. What changed was not the evidence. What changed was the questions the world had learned to ask of it. Consider it first as it existed in 1984. The biological material recovered from the scene was, to the investigators of that year, a tantalizing and ultimately mute object. The methods available to them were serological, the analysis of blood types and the small set of broad markers that the science of the period could resolve, methods that could place a sample within a large group of people and no nearer. A blood type is shared by a great many. The other serological markers available then narrowed the field somewhat further, but only somewhat, dividing the population into fractions rather than naming an individual within it. With those methods, a sample could be used to exclude a man, to say with confidence that this particular suspect could not have left this particular trace. And that is a genuine and valuable power, the power that has cleared the wrongly accused, for as long as the science has existed. But the same methods could not be used to include, not in any individuating way. They could narrow a county to a fraction of its men and leave the case exactly as lost as before, because a fraction of a county is not a name, and a name was the only thing the case lacked. There is a particular cruelty in possessing evidence of this kind. The material was not a vague impression or a fading memory. It was the attacker himself, in the only form he had left behind. A physical specimen of the man who had done this, sealed in an envelope in a small county's storage. Had it been recovered in a later decade, it would have ended the case in weeks. Recovered when it was, it could do nothing but wait. A perfect specimen of an unknown man. A complete answer written in a language no one yet knew how to read. The investigators preserved it with care precisely because they understood its potential value. And perhaps some of them suspected, as the science of DNA began its first stirrings in the laboratories of the world in those same years, that a day might come when the envelope could be made to speak. But its value in 1984 was potential only, a locked door for which no key yet existed. They sealed it, they logged it, they entered it under chain of custody, and they recorded, in effect, that here was the heart of the case, and that it could not yet be made to beat. Now consider the same material as it became in the years after 2020, when the key was finally cut. The science that had failed Terry Arndt for 40 years was DNA, and DNA had been transformed in the intervening decades beyond anything the 1984 investigators could have pictured. When that envelope was sealed, the use of DNA to identify an individual did not yet exist as a working tool of law enforcement anywhere in the world. By the time it was finally opened to a science that could answer it, DNA identification had become the most powerful instrument the field had ever known, and it had passed through more than one revolution on its way. The first revolution was the rise of DNA profiling itself, and with it, the creation of CODIS, the National Combined DNA Index System, the law enforcement database that allows an unknown crime scene profile to be compared against the profiles of known, convicted offenders and against the profiles developed in other unsolved cases. CODIS has closed thousands of cases that would otherwise have remained open forever, matching the trace from one crime to the offender of another, linking scenes across years and states. And for a case like this, it was the obvious first hope. At some point, the attacker's profile, developed from the preserved material, was searched against CODIS, and CODIS returned what it had always returned for this case: nothing. The man who had done this was not in the offender database. He had never, so far as the system knew, been convicted of the kind of crime that would have placed his profile on file, never given the law occasion to take his sample, never crossed the narrow threshold at which the state record demands DNA against his future. He had committed, on a dark road in 1984, an atrocity, and had then, by the evidence of the database, lived a life clean enough on its surface to keep his profile out of the one system built to catch him. The conventional DNA database, the tool that has closed thousands of cold cases, had no answer here, because the answer was not in it, and could not be coaxed into it, and would not be there however many times the search was run. That non-result is the crucial hinge of the modern case, and it is the reason the case waited still longer, even after DNA profiling existed. A crime scene profile with no database match is a strange and frustrating object. It is a complete and unique identifier of a specific human being, a genetic signature that belongs to exactly one man on Earth, and yet it is anonymous, a perfect description of a person whose name is unknown. For years, the case sat in that condition, possessing a flawless portrait of the killer and no way to attach it to a living man. What finally broke the stalemate was not a better version of the old idea, a bigger offender database, but a fundamentally new idea about whose DNA you compare against. That idea is forensic genetic genealogy, and it is the technology that ended this case. Forensic genetic genealogy works by inverting the question that CODIS asks. CODIS asks whether the crime scene profile matches a known offender already in the system, and for this case the answer was no. Forensic genetic genealogy asks a different and far more powerful question. Not who exactly is this, but who is this person related to, and how closely. It does so by taking the crime scene DNA and developing from it the kind of dense genetic profile used in consumer ancestry testing, then comparing that profile not against a database of criminals, but against the genetic data that hundreds of thousands of ordinary people have voluntarily uploaded to genealogy services, searching for the distant cousins, the shared ancestors, the faint and partial matches that betray a family tree. Where CODIS needs the offender himself to be on file, genetic genealogy needs only that some of his relatives, however distant, have ever tested their own DNA, which in the modern era, a great many people have. The pioneers of this technique in the criminal context are now established names, and it is worth naming them because they are the real instruments of the revolution that ended this case and dozens like it. Parabon Nanolabs was an early mover that brought genetic genealogy to law enforcement and paired it with phenotype prediction, the science of estimating physical traits, eye color, hair color, ancestry, the general cast of a face from DNA alone, so that even before a name is found, a sketch of the unknown contributor can be drawn from his own genetic code. Othram is a laboratory built specifically for the hardest part of the problem, the development of usable dense genealogical profiles from the small old, contaminated, and degraded samples that cold cases so often provide, the kind of decades-old material that defeats ordinary methods, and that, until such laboratories existed, was simply unworkable, too little, and too damaged to read. GEDmatch is the open genealogy database that became, alongside others, the working ground on which many of these comparisons are run. The place where the dense profile of the unknown contributor is set against the uploaded profiles of ordinary people, and the list of relatives is returned. These are the genuine engines of the modern cold case revolution, and it is upon instruments of exactly this kind, a laboratory able to read a 40-year-old trace, a database of voluntarily shared genetic profiles, and the patient genealogical labor that connects the two, that the resolution of the Burney case ultimately depended. The exact division of labor in this particular case, which laboratory developed the profile, which database returned the matches, which analysts built the trees, has not been detailed publicly in full, and it would be wrong to invent those specifics or to attribute the work to any named individual without basis. But the method is not in doubt, because it is the method by which cases of precisely this shape, a preserved trace, a CODIS dead end, and a killer who was somebody's distant cousin, are now being solved across the country, week after week, in jurisdictions large and small, returning answers to families who had long since stopped expecting them. The procedure, narrated as the careful sequence it is, runs roughly as follows. The preserved crime scene sample, the same material sealed in 1984, is subjected to modern extraction and sequencing capable of reading hundreds of thousands of genetic markers, far beyond the handful that a CODIS profile uses. This is itself a delicate and uncertain step with old evidence, because the quantity and quality of recoverable material constrains everything that follows, and a sample that is too small or too degraded may yield a profile too thin to work with. Where the material allows, the dense profile is built and then uploaded, under the rules and permissions that govern such databases, into the genealogical comparison. The system returns a list of people who share segments of DNA with the unknown contributor, ranked by how much they share, which corresponds to how closely they are related. None of these matches is the killer. They are his relatives, most of them distant, most of them people who have never heard of Burney or of Terry Arndt, who tested their DNA to learn about their own ancestry and unknowingly left a thread that led back toward a crime. From those threads, the genealogists build outward, and this is the painstaking human labor at the center of the technique, the part that no machine performs and no database resolves. On its own, the shared DNA matches arrive as a ranked list, each match a person who holds in common with the unknown contributor some measurable quantity of genetic material, and that quantity, expressed in the units genealogists use, is the whole key, because the amount of DNA two people share falls predictably with the distance of their relationship. A great deal of shared material means a close relative, a parent, a sibling, a child, and such a match would solve a case almost at once. Very little shared material means a distant one, a third or fourth or fifth cousin, a person who shares with the contributor only a great-great-grandparent or someone further back still, and it is with these faint and distant matches that genetic genealogy most often must work, because the close relatives of a man who has avoided the law have usually avoided the databases as well. Using those distant matches as anchors, The genealogists construct family trees, reaching back through the generations to the common ancestors that the shared segments imply, and then forward again down the branches, assembling, through census records and birth and marriage and death records, and the whole documentary apparatus of public genealogy, the descendants of those ancestors. The work proceeds by triangulation. A single distant match, taken alone, points only to a vast cloud of possible relatives, a couple 2 centuries dead, and the thousands of people descended from them. But a second distant match, descending from a different line, narrows the cloud, because the contributor must lie where the 2 trees intersect, must descend from ancestors common to both matches. A third match narrows it further, and a fourth, and with each match incorporated the field of possible descendants contracts, generation by generation, from a sprawling extended family spread across a continent to a handful of branches to, eventually, a small set of living candidates of the right age and the right sex. Men who could plausibly have been on a dark road near Burney in the autumn of 1984. It is genealogy practiced as forensics, the family tree run in reverse to find not an ancestor, but a culprit. And it is slow, uncertain, and frequently doomed. The trees may not converge. The matches may be too distant to triangulate. The records too thin to bridge a gap in a poor migratory line. The candidate pool too large to narrow to one. A single adoption, an unrecorded birth, a name changed at a border, can break a branch that the analysis depends upon. The method can take weeks or months of labor, and can end, after all of it, in a probable region of a family tree and no single name. And in many cases, that is exactly where it ends. In this case, it did not. The trees converged, the branches narrowed, and at the place where the descending lines crossed, the analysis found a man who had been living the entire time, about a mile from where Terry Arndt had died. The trees converged, as they sometimes do, on a man who had been there all along. His name was Roger Schmidt, and at the time of the crime in 1984, he had been a grown man living roughly a mile from the turnout where Terry Arndt was killed. He was, in the most ordinary and chilling sense of the word, a neighbor, not a drifter who had turned off the highway at random and vanished into another state by morning, not a stranger to the country who had stumbled upon that unlit lane by impossible luck, but a man who lived down the road, who knew the turnouts because everyone who lived there knew the turnouts, who could have walked or driven to that dark place in a few minutes and back again, and who had then gone home and lived for the next 4 decades. An unremarkable life within a mile of the spot where he had left a teenager dead. This is the moment the case turns from a mystery of identity into a problem of proof. And it is worth being precise about what the genealogy had and had not done. The genealogical work did not by itself convict anyone. What it produced was a lead, a single named individual whom the family tree analysis pointed to as the likely source of the crime scene DNA. A lead developed through genetic genealogy is treated properly as an investigative pointer and not as evidence in itself, the beginning of a confirmation process rather than its end. The reason for that discipline is the same reason the 1984 investigators refused to draw conclusions at the scene. An inference, however compelling, is not a proof, and the law requires more than a probable answer to take a man's liberty. The genealogy had told the investigators where to look. It had not yet told a courtroom anything at all. So the work of the case, in its final phase, became the work of closing the distance between a strong investigative lead and a direct individualizing match, of confirming that the man the family trees pointed to was in fact the man whose DNA had been waiting in a sealed envelope since 1984. This distinction is not a technicality, and the discipline around it is what separates a sound case from a wrongful one. A genealogical lead, however strong, is an inference drawn from the DNA of other people. It says that the contributor descends from a certain place in a certain family tree, and that one living man fits the place better than any other. That is a reason to look at a man. It is not by itself a reason to convict him, because the genealogy has never compared the suspect's own DNA to the crime scene at all. It has only compared his relative's DNA and reasoned to him. That confirmation in cases of this kind is therefore accomplished by obtaining a sample of DNA directly from the identified individual and comparing it by the conventional and highly individuating methods of forensic DNA analysis, the same methods used in CODIS and in the courtroom, against the crime scene profile preserved since 1984. This is the step that converts an investigative pointer into evidence a jury can be asked to trust. The genealogy narrows the world to one man. The direct comparison, suspect's own sample against the trace from the scene, proves that the one man is the one, and does so with the astronomical certainty that modern DNA matching can claim, the certainty of a profile that belongs, in all the human population, to a single living person. Investigators have not publicly detailed every step by which Roger Schmidt's reference sample was obtained and compared in this case, and it would be improper to fabricate that texture, the specific procedure, any particular figure, any quoted official. But the logic is the logic of every genetic genealogy resolution, and it is the logic on which this one rests. The family tree finds him, and the direct match, his DNA against the evidence sealed 41 years before, proves it. With a name attached at last to the sealed envelope, the scattered facts of that autumn night could be assembled into a single account, and the reconstruction is the more terrible for how ordinary its first half is. Reconsider the night now in the light of who the man in the darkness was. Terry Arndt and his girlfriend had driven out, as countless couples in Bernie had, to a quiet turnout on a dark road, a place chosen because it was unlit and unwatched. A place that offered them the privacy that a small mountain town affords its young people only in the spaces the streetlights do not reach. They parked. The engine ticked and cooled. The windows began to fog in the deep cold of the elevation. For a while it was only the two of them, and the forest, and the silence. And down the lane, perhaps a mile away, lived a man who knew that road, and knew that turnout, and knew, as everyone in that country knew, that this was where couples went on dark autumn nights. A mile in that country is nothing. A mile is a few minutes by vehicle, and not much more on foot for a man who knows the ground, a distance a person could cover in either direction, under cover of the same darkness that hid everything else. The reconstruction supported by the evidence is the reconstruction of an ambush by someone to whom the place was entirely familiar, an approach through a darkness that hid him precisely because he understood that darkness, a crime that required no luck and no chance discovery because it was committed on what was, for him, home ground. He did not need to search for the turnout. He knew it. He did not need to fear the road. It was his own. He came to the parked car across ground he had crossed 1,000 times. He was not seen because there was no light to see him by and no witness on a road that carried no traffic after dark. He was not heard because the few sounds that crossed the cold forest that night dissolved, to anyone who happened to catch them, into the ordinary night noise of a town set against a wilderness, an engine somewhere, a sound somewhere nothing a sleeping neighbor would rise for. In a few violent minutes, Terry Arndt was shot and killed, and his girlfriend was assaulted, and then the man turned and walked back into the same darkness that had brought him, carrying the weapon that would never be found, crossing the leaf fall that held no track, leaving behind him no disorder and no trail, and was gone, back down the mile of dark lane to an ordinary house and an ordinary life that he would inhabit, undisturbed, for the next 41 years. The cold and the dark, which had seemed to the young couple like privacy, had been, from the attacker's side, concealment. And that is the cruelest fact of the geography. Every quality of that place that made it a refuge made it also a trap. The isolation that meant no one would disturb them meant also that no one would help them. The darkness that hid their privacy hid his approach. The forest floor that muffled their evening muffled his footsteps and his retreat. The reconstruction is not, in its broad strokes, complicated. It is the oldest and simplest shape of predatory violence, a known place, an unobserved hour, a familiar attacker, and a victim who had no reason to fear the dark because the dark had always, before that night, been safe. What made it unsolvable for 40 years was not the complexity of the crime, but the perfection of the concealment. And what made it solvable at last was the one thing the attacker could not carry away into the darkness with him, the trace of himself he left behind in a place he could not see to clean. And so we returned to the gravel lane and the overcast July morning of 2025, to the 3 unmarked vehicles and the tactically dressed officers spreading without a word along a property line at the edge of Bernie, and to the modest single-story house set back among the pines where a 61-year-old man was beginning an ordinary day. We returned to it, now understanding what we did not understand at the start, that the quiet neighbor in that house was the man from the dark road, that the mile between his door and the turnout was a mile he had lived inside for 41 years, and that the knock about to come was the sound of a sealed envelope finally speaking the name it had held since 1984. The arrest itself was, as arrests in these cases so often are, almost without drama, and that absence of drama is its own kind of statement. There was no struggle. The man who had eluded an answer for 4 decades did not run and did not fight. He came to his door in the gray morning light, was told that a warrant had been issued for his arrest in connection with the 1984 death of Terrence Arndt, and asked only what this was about. His composure, described by those present as strangely settled, the calm of a man for whom the knock, when it finally came, was less a shock than the arrival of something long expected. He was taken into custody and removed from the lane he had lived on, past the line of pines, past the turnout a mile away that most of the people who drove the road no longer connected to anything at all, and the long silence of the case was, at that moment, over. It is worth dwelling on what the investigators did and did not say in that moment, because the restraint is the point. They did not announce a theory on the doorstep. They executed a warrant that had been issued because the evidence, at last, supported it, the genetic genealogy having pointed to the man and the confirmation having closed the distance to proof. The arrest was not the beginning of an accusation, but the end of a verification, the visible surface of years of patient laboratory and genealogical work that the public would never see. The man was named at his door not on a hunch, but on the strength of the one piece of evidence that had survived everything, the trace he had left at the scene and could never retrieve. The dark road had finally given up the one thing it had kept. The case that came before the court was, in its essentials, the case the evidence had always contained, now finally legible. The presentation to the court retold the night a second time, not as the live reconstruction of an investigation feeling its way in the dark, but as the settled account of a proven crime. And the difference between those two tellings is the difference between a question and an answer. The prosecution did not need to speculate about a stranger or argue from the absence of one. It could say who had been on that road, because the science said so, and it could trace the line from the sealed envelope of 1984 to the man in the courtroom in a chain that the defense could not break. The spine of that presentation was, as it had to be, the DNA, because the DNA was the only witness the crime had ever had. The story told to the court was the story of the trace recovered at the scene in 1984, of how it had been collected and sealed and labeled and logged on the first morning, of how it had been carried unbroken through 40 years of dormancy by the chain of custody the original investigators had maintained, never lost, never compromised, never confused with any other thing. It was the story of a piece of evidence that had been mute under the serology of its own era, able only to exclude and never to name, anonymous even under the CODIS search of a later one, a perfect profile of a man who was not in the system, and finally made to speak by forensic genetic genealogy, the family tree run in reverse, and then confirmed, beyond the reach of doubt, by the direct comparison of the defendant's own sample to the trace itself. It was a story of method as much as of crime, of the long patience of evidence kept safe by people who could not yet use it and handed forward across decades to a science that could. And it was, in the end, a stronger case than any eyewitness could ever have built, because memory fades and falters and can be honestly mistaken, while the trace did not change in 40 years and pointed, when at last it could be read, to exactly one man. There was no witness who could have named the attacker, no one who had seen his face in that darkness, no confession freely given, no accomplice to turn. There was only the genetic certainty, the cold and absolute fact that the man on trial and the man on the road were one and the same. And that certainty was the case. The defense could attack a memory. It could not attack a match between a man's own DNA and the evidence he had left at the scene of a killing he believed the darkness had hidden forever. The verdict, when it came, carried none of the noise that fiction gives such moments. There was no outburst, no theatrical collapse, none of the drama that the long arc of the case might seem to have earned. The case had done its work long before the courtroom, in the evidence locker and the laboratory and the slow construction of the family trees, and by the time the matter reached its conclusion, the outcome had the quiet inevitability of arithmetic. In December of 2025, just months after the quiet arrest on the gravel lane, Roger Schmidt was held to account for what he had done on a dark road in the autumn of 1984. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Life without parole, after 41 years after a teenager dead and a young woman assaulted on an unlit turnout a mile from the killer's own door, after 4 decades in which the answer sat sealed and silent in a county evidence room. The matter ended not with a confession or a deathbed whisper or a witness rising at last to point across the room, but with a sentence read into a quiet courtroom, the cold geometry of the case resolving at the very end into a single, final, unappealable fact. The man who had walked back into the darkness in 1984, certain that the darkness had hidden him, would not walk out of a prison. The mile of dark lane between his door and the turnout, the distance he had relied upon and lived inside for so long, had closed at last. It would be wrong to let the procedure crowd out the people for whom it was undertaken, because the case was never, in the end, about DNA or databases or family trees. Those are only the instruments. The case was about a young man named Terry Arndt, who was 18 years old and at the very start of his adult life, recently finished with school, known and liked in a small town, with all the unremarkable ordinary future that an 18-year-old is owed, and who has now been gone for far longer than he was ever alive, and whose death sat unanswered over his family and his town for 41 years. 41 years is longer than many lifetimes. It is long enough for parents to grow old and to die without an answer, long enough for the young people who knew him to become grandparents, long enough for the very memory of the crime to thin into a story the town told, rather than a wound the town felt. The answer, when it came late enough that some of those who most deserved it were no longer alive to hear it. It was about the young woman who survived that night, too. And her part of the story is the one most easily lost in the procedure, and the most important not to lose. She carried what was done to her through 4 decades in which no one could tell her who had done it. 4 decades in which the man responsible lived unnamed and unpunished somewhere in the same world she moved through, perhaps in the same county, in fact on the same network of mountain roads, a mile from where it had happened. To survive such a night is to be handed a question that does not close, and she lived inside that open question for most of her life. The resolution of the case cannot undo any of that. It cannot return the years, or the young man, or the future that the dark road took. It can only, at the very last, replace a 41-year silence with an answer, and put the man who did it behind a wall he will not come back from. An answer, however late, is not nothing. For the people who waited a lifetime for it, it may be very nearly everything. For the town of Burney, the arrest was its own kind of reckoning, and a complicated one. A crime like this, in a place this small, becomes part of the ground itself, a thing the community lives on top of, repeated to newcomers, half remembered by the young, carried as a permanent unease by those who had been there when it happened. For 40 years the town had lived with the open wound of it, and for 40 years, without knowing, it had lived with the man who had made the wound, had perhaps stood near him in a store, passed his truck on the main road, nodded to him across a fence, to learn that the man responsible had been there all along. A neighbor on a nearby lane was to learn that the danger had never been the stranger on the highway the town might have comforted itself by imagining, the drifter who had come and gone and taken the threat away with him, but a familiar figure who had stayed, who had moved among them unremarked for 4 decades, ordinary in every visible way. That is the particular horror of a case solved this way, the discovery that the monster was a neighbor, and it unsettles a community in a manner that a captured stranger never could, because it asks the town to reconsider 40 years of an ordinary face. But it is also, in a strange and almost poetic way, the particular justice of this method, because the very closeness that let the killer hide in plain sight is the closeness the evidence finally used to find him. He could not escape his own family tree. The science did not need him to confess, did not need a witness to his face, did not need him to slip and place himself at a cove or a scene. It needed only that he had relatives, as every man does, and that some of them, somewhere, had tested their own DNA out of nothing more than curiosity about where they came from. The distant cousins whose shared genetic threads led the genealogist back to his branch were, without ever knowing it, the proof that he had never truly been a stranger to anyone, least of all to the place he had hidden in. He had counted on the darkness of a remote road. He had not counted on the fact that no man, however isolated, is ever genetically alone. There is a lesson in this case, and it is not the easy one. The easy lesson would be that science always wins in the end, that every dark road eventually gives up its secret, and that is comforting, and not entirely true. Science did not win on its own, and it does not always win at all. The trace that solved this case survived only because human beings in 1984, working with tools that could not yet read it, and could not have imagined the tools that one day would, had the discipline to collect it, to seal it, to label it, and to keep it safe across 4 decades of dormancy for a future they could not see and would mostly not live to witness. Had any link in that long chain failed, had the envelope been discarded in some house cleaning of an old evidence room, had the chain of custody broken, had a single careless hand confused it with another case, there would have been nothing for the new science to read, and Roger Schmidt would have died a free and unknown man a mile from where he killed. The science is only half the story. The other half is the patience of an evidence locker, the integrity of a chain of custody maintained across decades by people who never once learned the answer their care was preserving. The refusal of a small mountain county to throw away a sealed envelope it had no way to use and no certainty it ever would. That refusal was an act of faith in a future that owed it nothing. Forensic genetic genealogy did not solve this case alone, and it should never be allowed to take the whole of the credit. It finished what careful hands had begun 41 years earlier, in the cold of a forest morning, and trusted the future to complete. The future kept the trust. That is the rarer and the truer lesson, and it is worth holding on to. The answer was found because someone, long before there was any reason to hope, decided not to let the evidence be lost. And there is a harder lesson, the one the geography keeps insisting on. The same isolation that draws people to the high country of far northern California, the dark roads, and the deep forest, and the enormous mountain silence, is the isolation that let a crime go unwitnessed and a killer go unseen for 4 decades. The very emptiness that felt like privacy to 2 teenagers on an autumn night was the emptiness that delivered them to a man who knew the darkness better than they did. Isolation is not safety. The places with no cameras and no witnesses and no lights are the places where the most can happen and the least be known. And the long cold of this case is, in part, the long cold of a town whose own remoteness kept its deepest wound from healing for 41 years. We tell these stories not for the dread of them, but because the answer, when it finally comes, is a kind of proof that the truth can outlast the people who first reach for it, and that no darkness, however total, is permanent. So we end where we began, on a gravel lane at the edge of a mountain town on an overcast July morning, with 3 unmarked vehicles and a quiet knock, and a man at his door who asked only what this was about. We understand the calm now. It was the calm of a man who had carried a secret for 41 years, and who had always known somewhere beneath the ordinary life on the ordinary lane that the dark road had kept something he could not take back, and that the knock would come. It took a detail no one had looked at for 40 years. It took the patience to keep it and the science to read it. And it brought a teenager's killer, at last, to his own front door. If you want to keep following stories recreated with this level of investigative depth, subscribe so you do not miss the next case file. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from tonight. See you in the next case, where we continue to explore the truths buried behind cases once thought to have no resolution.